Hello everyone, and welcome to the 267th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Tony Spilotro and his fictional counterpart, Nicky Santoro. If you're a fan of my videos, consider signing up to become a patron, where you can get access to my videos a day early ad-free for just $2 a month. And with all the changes YouTube has made recently, the channel is currently in need of any help you can offer it. So again, if you're a fan of my videos, please consider signing up using the link in the description. At this point, there have been countless mob movies made over the years, but as with anything, only a select few can be considered the best of the best, and Casino is without a doubt one of those films. Between the storytelling, the cinematography, and the performances, Casino has solidified itself as a giant in its genre, and a favorite of mob movie aficionados everywhere. And there's no doubt that one of the biggest reasons why this is because of Joe Pesci's portrayal of Nicky Santoro, who I would argue is one of cinema's greatest and most memorable villains. But as most of you will know, Nicky Santoro, like many of the greats that have appeared in Scorsese films, was based on a real gangster, the infamous Tony the Ant Spilotro, who was just as brutal, if not more so, than his fictional counterpart. So in order for us to get a real handle on the evil of this larger-than-life figure, we're going to use information we receive in both the book this film was based on, Casino, Love and Honor in Las Vegas, and the film itself, so we might understand fully the evil of Tony Spilotro and how he came to be the terror that he was. But if you're a fan of great pieces of art like Casino, then I know you'll love what our sponsor for this video, Lost in Cult, has to offer. Lost in Cult is best known for their high-end premium deep dive books on Alan Wake, Animal Well, mouthwashing, and the now shipping Outer Wilds design works. But they've just launched an exciting new product, World of Horror, the board game, the Eldritch Pact between Lost in Cult, Pavel Kosminski, and Duspert Games. To celebrate this momentous occasion, Lost in Cult has created these special deluxe editions that only enhance the already beautiful art of this game. Included in the deluxe edition is the Book of Endings, and 3 exclusive mysteries that were crafted with the help of acclaimed writers such as Ifumi Kono, creator of Clock Tower, deepening World of Horror's chilling tribute to the genre that inspired it. The deluxe edition also includes 5 alternative collectible mystery end cards, and each card is hand-illustrated by acclaimed artists from the Japanese horror scene, with Kago Shintaro, Kojima Miyako, Noroi Michiru, and World of Horror the board game's illustrator Izma, each offering their own interpretation of World of Horror sublime creatures. The deluxe edition of World of Horror the board game is also available in the extremely limited Guru edition, which unveils hand-signed prints of the reinterpreted artwork. And there isn't just one, but 2 color variants of the deluxe edition in limited stocks of 300 each, that are available in Neo 80s and Shrouded, that collectors are sure to love. However, though Neo 80s is available exclusively through Lost in Cult, the Shrouded variant is available through their partnership with IGN, on IGN Store. So if that one has piqued your interest, be sure to head over there to check that one out further. But if you're watching after the campaign is closed on April 30th, or just want the standard edition by itself for all of its incredible content and art, the standard edition will remain available, but be quick if you want to get your hands on the deluxe editions. Lost in Cult always produces truly incredible must-have products, and if you're as enamored with World of Horror the board game as I am, be sure to head over to www.lostincult.co.uk or click the link in the description to check out the beautiful piece of playable art that is World of Horror the board game. And as an added bonus, be sure to enter the code VILEYWOH, that's VILEYWOH, to get 10% off your purchase of World of Horror the board game or anything else from their amazing store right now. Thank you Lost in Cult for sponsoring this video. Now without further ado, let's begin. When examining the life and legacy of an evildoer, one of the first questions we often ask is, where did it all start? How does a person, who was born as innocent as any other, become a villain? Well, as with everything in life, there's always a beginning. And for some people, the path they'd walk towards damnation is set for them before they're even born. And so it was for Nicky Santoro, or as he was known in real life, Anthony Spilotro. Tony the Ant Spilotro grew up in a 2-story wooden gray bungalow in an Italian neighborhood just a few blocks from Lefty's home. Tony and his 5 brothers, Vincent, Victor, Patrick, Johnny, and Michael, slept in one room in 3 sets of bunk beds. Tony's father, Patsy, owned Patsy's restaurant at the corner of Grand and Ogden Avenues. It was a small place famous for homemade meatballs that attracted customers from all over town, including outfit guys like Tony Accardo, Paul the Waiter Rica, Sam Giancana, Gussie Alex, and Jackie Cerrone. Patsy's parking lot was often used for mob meetings. From this small amount of information, a few things in particular stand out. One is that Tony's parents set down their roots in an Italian neighborhood and operated a restaurant that was a frequent hangout for members of the Chicago outfit. The significance of this cannot be understated, as while anyone living in a neighborhood like the one Tony grew up in would be susceptible to the allure of a life of crime like so many around him were, for Tony, and by extension his brothers, they likely witnessed more criminal activity than the other kids their age did via their father's business, and so they were afforded glimpses of the glamour of mob life in ways that other kids weren't, that influenced them appropriately. This is what I meant by an evildoer's path being set for them before they're born, as while Tony's parents could never have known the course their children would take in life, they unknowingly laid the foundations for them to take such a path. Something that's never guaranteed, but that's made all the more likely by the environment a person grows up in, and the people that surround them in that environment, which is only made all the more evident by the fact that 5 out of the 6 Spilotro children would end up pursuing a life of crime. However, the other thing to note here is how these boys lived in their home. Now, sleeping in one room with all your brothers is far from being the worst living conditions a child could endure, and no one should fault the Spilotro parents for doing the best they could with what they had. But along with exposure to the prestige and respect of mob life, Tony's life at home doubtlessly contributed to his desire to rise above his humble origins so he might become something more, a man like the ones he likely idolized as a youth. And when you add in the fact that Tony was only 5'2", fully grown, you had yourself a little boy who dreamt of more through a life of crime that became a man obsessed with that dream. As again, Tony didn't want to be a nobody who did what he could to scrape by. He wanted to be somebody, a man of respect, a man who could live how he wanted, do what he wanted when he wanted to, and that nobody would dare to step to in any way, no matter how big or how small. Tony didn't just want to be a thief like all of us anymore. He wanted to be a racketeer. Within a couple of years, Tony starts hanging with a guy by the name Vinny the Saint in Cerro, who was even shorter than Tony. He was about 5'1", but he was the guy who introduced Tony to all the outfit guys like Jimmy Turk Torello, Charles Chucky Nicoletti, Philip Milwaukee Phil Aldericio, William Potatoes Dodano, Sammy Pigs, Joseph Joe the Clown Lombardo, and Joseph Joe Dove Zayapa, who later became the outfit's top boss. As these guys got bigger, Tony stayed close. He did whatever they wanted. One of these days, I'm going to be the boss of the whole syndicate. This was the ambition of Anthony Spilotro, and to his credit, he had some mighty tools to aid him in this endeavor: his violent nature and his intellect. In the film, they explain how Nicky was relentless, how if you stepped to him with your fists, he'd come back with a bat, and if you came with a bat, he'd come back with a knife, and so on and so forth. And in reality, he was exactly as fearless and stubborn as he was portrayed to be in this story. Tony was the toughest kid I knew. He was so tough that his brother Victor used to offer guys $5 to see if they could beat him up. Usually, Victor got a taker, and the guy would try to kick Tony's ass, but if it looked like Tony was gonna lose, we'd all jump on the kid and break his head. More than that though, he was merciless, cruel, and sadistic when it came to dealing with his enemies. We all know that famous scene in Casino where Nicky is taking care of a man named Billy McCarthy who dared to shoot up one of Remo's bars with his friend Charlie M. And in order to get the name of his accomplice, Nicky and his fellow gangsters torture this man relentlessly, to the point that they stick his head in a vise until one of his eyes pops out. As gruesome as this scene is, this is one of those cases where reality is actually more horrific than fiction, as this was not one of the murders Tony committed while he was out in Vegas, but the first murder that he ever committed. And he did it the same way that Nicky did in the film, though here, the cherry on top was Tony pouring lighter fluid on his face and setting it on fire to finish the job. That's right, this was the very first murder this man ever committed. And if that doesn't tell you what kind of a remorseless horror show Tony Spilotro was, I don't know what will. But like I mentioned a moment ago, it wasn't just his brutality that made Tony so successful, but his intellect, which by all accounts was rather extraordinary. Tony was a totally focused human being. He woke up in the morning knowing exactly what he was going to do that day. He'd get dozens of calls at the gold rush. He had all kinds of financial dealings going on at the same time. He had different groups, hundreds of people, a million schemes, all of them in various stages of development. And even though most of them never panned out, he still had to put in a 16 to 18 hour day trying to put the deals together. It would have been difficult doing what Tony did if he had secretaries, a filing system, Xerox machines, and the free use of a phone. But Tony did it all off the cuff and kept it all in his head. The only things he ever wrote down were telephone numbers, and he used to write them down in the tiniest little handwriting that made them unreadable without a magnifying glass. And when we'd get a hold of them, we found he would transpose the numbers or write half or 3/4 of each number backwards. Tony was the smartest and most efficient mobster I had ever seen. I think he was a genius. His biggest problem was that he was surrounded by people who were always screwing up. That's all we kept hearing him say over and over. He'd harangue his crew about their incompetence, and how he had no choice but to do things himself if he wanted them done right. All of these things made Tony a force to reckon with. So after making a name for himself in Chicago and moving to Vegas, it only makes too much sense that Tony would quickly take advantage of the lack of blatant mob presence in Vegas and attempt to make it his own. And, with another terrifying trait of his, he was well on his way to enriching and empowering himself and making life hell for everyone else around him. Tony had no capacity whatever for casual conversation. He could be congenial, cordial, likable, but you couldn't waste his time. He lost his temper faster than anyone I ever knew. There was no slow burn. He went right from being nice to being a screaming, violent maniac in a second. There was no way to prepare for him. I think the speed with which you were suddenly under attack was as terrifying as the thought of having Tony mad at you. However, once it passed, it passed. He forgot it. He went back to business. All that being said, Tony was no tyrant, and he treated those around him and who were in business with him as fairly as he was able to in order to earn their respect, loyalty, and the peace of mind that both of these things afforded him. On a $15,000 score, Tony would give me $3,000 just for making sure the guy doesn't skip and for bringing him back the money. Tony was a very generous guy. When he was moving around town, he always picked up checks. It didn't matter. 20, 30 people, Tony always got the check, and he'd get really pissed off if you tried to take care of the tip. That was his too. Nobody paid for his food. Ultimately, these things are what made Tony Spilotro such a terrifying man in real life, and Nicky Santoro such an effective villain on screen. Even more so when you consider that what you see in the film is a fairly accurate echo of what Tony actually did to people. Because you know, watching Nicky in action in this film, as terrifying as he and his actions were, that they were only a fraction of what the people who actually went toe-to-toe with Tony Spilotro experienced. But why is Nicky such a terrifyingly effective villain? Why were the people in this story, and in the real world, so terrified of a little man with such a big mouth? Well, for one, he was fearless, brutal, and well-connected, and everyone knows you don't fuck with a mobster, because if you do, you're going to have a line of other mobsters waiting to cut your heart out the instant they get wind you did anything to anyone in their circle. But two, because the people Tony was antagonizing were average everyday people who dared to get caught up in the wrong thing, who had no hope of going up against a personality like Tony. Because as much as you might think you, if you came face to face with a man like Tony, would be able to hold your own, I guarantee that making the attempt would be about as foolish as slapping a grizzly bear across its nose. Yeah, he was small, but he was a veritable demon, and you knew just by looking into those cold, crazed eyes of his, that if you even lifted a pinky finger out of line, he would tear your head off or die trying. And that's why Tony was such a force in life, and why his fictional counterpart was so terrifying to watch in action. But as smart and brutally efficient as Tony was, when it came down to it, he was his own worst enemy. Though he had big dreams and big ideas about how to achieve those dreams, he was always an egotistical, envious, and unhinged man who couldn't help but feel entitled to everything he wanted and feel slighted by even the smallest of offenses, by even the closest of friends. As much as Tony expanded his power base by coming to Vegas and running it in any way he wished to, he also spat in the face of everyone he came across in so many ways. Friends, enemies, and even his wife, who he seemed to have a much better relationship with in the film, but who he was cold and abusive to in real life. The cops and the feds had a target on his back for nearly the moment he set foot in Vegas, and the bosses back home only tolerated him and his recklessness insofar as they kept getting paid and were insulated from his actions. Even one of his best friends, a man who he'd known since he was a kid, wasn't immune from Tony's recklessness. For as much as Ace Rothstein, Lefty Rosenthal, made his bed with the way he acted as well, it was Tony who ultimately hammered the nails into the coffin that was his career in Vegas. Not to mention how he enabled and had an affair with his wife Jerry, or Ginger in the film. But what really did him in is that Tony, the little man who always wanted to be more, always believed he was as big as he wanted to be, even when he wasn't. The truth is, and I know this for sure, Tony was as light as a feather in the outfit. The public perception was the opposite of the fact. All Nevada, Mo Dalitz, my own wife for God's sake, all thought Tony was the boss of Las Vegas. But the truth was, he wasn't. But he began to believe his own PR. And that he did, getting a big enough head that made him feel as if he was immune from prosecution, and immune from any move any other gangster might have tried to make against him. But Tony Spilotro, as big as he could have been, was always smaller than he thought he was, especially in the minds of the people who mattered, the Midwest bosses, who, after getting themselves thrown in prison in large part because of the way Tony conducted himself in Vegas, finally had enough and ended him. And they did so in a way that let Tony, his brother, and everyone else for that matter, know that he was nothing. Not a man of respect, nor anyone who deserves a clean and peaceful death, but a blight on their lives that deserved to be erased in one of the most brutal ways possible. However, the sad truth about Nicky Santoro, Tony Spilotro, is that beneath all the philandering, the stealing, and the violence, he was a man like any other, one with a heart and a great intellect, who could have been anything he wanted to be, had he not been born into the world he was born into, and been influenced by the villains who inhabited that world. He was a man who made sure he was home every morning to make breakfast for his son, a man who paid his employees fairly, helped friends out when they were in need, and was generous with his money. But through his environment, ambition, pride, a complete lack of mercy or remorse, and an ego bigger than any casino ever erected on the Strip, Tony Spilotro became a gangster's gangster and everybody's worst nightmare. A man who could gouge someone's eyes out at 4 a.m. and be home to greet his son with a warm hug and a smile at 6:30. One who was never satisfied with what he had, that was always looking for more, no matter how foolhardy that may have been. A man who was responsible for an enormous amount of suffering and death, who improved the lives of few and harmed the lives of so many more. And in the end, he and his brother both paid the ultimate price for his reckless ambition and the monstrosity that was his person, and for being a gangster that even gangsters couldn't bear, and a man who destroyed the lives of so many, innocent or otherwise. Tony Spilotro will always be remembered for being the beast he was, and a man whose soul was thoroughly drenched in evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Nicky and Tony? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially our Dark Lord patrons, Elijah Kai VA, Mr. Awesome, Louis Doxtator, Just Keeping It Real, Lachlan, Atris Rain, Selt Sopa, Him Downstairs, Off Mega, and Beep Boop. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.